Adolfo Bruno was a serious man in a serious position, strong enough to control Western Massachusetts rackets of the Genovese crime family, but still beneath the New York administration that could make, break, or kill a man in that seat. By the early 2000s, Arthur Negro had risen to acting boss of the Genovese family, and federal prosecutors later said his reach extended from the Bronx into Springfield. That is how a parking lot murder in Massachusetts became a 5 families case in Manhattan federal court. The federal case later laid out Bruno's end in blunt terms. Prosecutors said Negro ordered Bruno killed in November 2003 to increase his own power and position in the family and to punish Bruno for speaking with the FBI. The men who handled the planning on the Springfield side, according to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, were Fotios Freddie Gaius and his brother Ty Gaius, both Genovese associates in Springfield. The official line from the later conviction was that Negro gave the order. Freddie and Ty planned the hit, and a shooter was recruited to carry it out. Bruno was gunned down in Springfield on November 23, 2003. Years later, that killing was still sitting at the center of multiple racketeering trials, life sentences, and prison politics that would stretch all the way to Whitey Bulger's last day alive. The Bruno murder did not stand alone. Once federal prosecutors opened up the Springfield crew and the Negro case, the picture widened into the kind of violent internal file that only a 5 families prosecution really captures. Negro, Fotios, and Ty Gaius were also convicted for the November 2003 murder of Gary Westerman in Agawam, Massachusetts, after the government said they believed Westerman was cooperating with state police. They were also convicted in the attempted murder of Frank Dadabo in the Bronx, a shooting Negro ordered over a union-related dispute. On top of that came conspiracy counts tied to Luis Santos, who they believed was cooperating, and Giuseppe Manzi, described in the sentencing release as the leader of a rival criminal faction in Springfield. That is the proper frame for Bruno's story. It was not one isolated mob assassination. It was part of a broader Genovese campaign of internal control, retaliation, and rank building across New York and Massachusetts. Bruno's crew was local in geography, but New York in authority. Negro was the acting boss in New York. Bruno was the Springfield captain. The Gaius brothers were Springfield associates, doing work that prosecutors said served the wider family. The same indictment that carried Bruno's murder also carried extortion and other racketeering crimes in the Genovese structure. In other words, Springfield was not some independent New England sideshow. It was a functioning Massachusetts faction tied into a New York family command. Once Bruno was dead, the old arrangement was finished, and the government's later trials made clear that the fight over Springfield had been treated inside the family as a real power struggle, not a local misunderstanding. The convictions in 2011 closed the legal story for that phase with maximum force. Negro, Fotios, and Ty were all sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of multiple murders, racketeering, extortion, attempted murder, murder conspiracies, and loan sharking. The sentencing release is clear on Bruno's place in the story. It identifies him as a captain in the Genovese family and says Negro ordered the hit to build his own power and punish Bruno for talking to the FBI. It says the Gaius brothers planned the murder and recruited the actual shooter. That sentence package effectively turned the Springfield internal war into a federal monument. Bruno was dead. Negro was buried in prison. The Gaius brothers were buried in prison. The New York leadership had lost one captain, and then lost some of the men who had removed him. Then the story sat for years in prison and waited for another body. James Whitey Bulger arrived at USP Hazleton in West Virginia on October 29, 2018, after a transfer from Florida. By the next morning, he was dead. Reuters reported that Bulger, already serving life after his 2013 conviction, was killed shortly after the transfer. The AP later reported that prosecutors said Fotios and Paul DeCollegiero spent about 7 minutes in Bulger's cell, while Sean McKinnon moved away and then returned. Prosecutors also said inmate witnesses later described Bulger as a snitch, and one witness said De Collegiero had announced that as soon as Bulger reached their unit, they planned to kill him. The prison killing was not random prison chaos. It was a targeted inmate execution, and the lead name in that execution was the same Fotios who had already gone away for the Bruno murder. That is the Springfield-Genovese link in its hardest form. Bulger did not get killed by some nameless inmate with no underworld history. He got killed by a man already serving life for the murder of Adolfo Bruno and Gary Westerman, a man Reuters described as an associate of the Genovese crime family. That gives the prison killing its full organized crime weight. Whitey had spent years as one of the most notorious informants in American mob history, an Irish gang leader who had fed the FBI while his own enemies were being crushed. Gaius had spent years inside the Genovese orbit, where informants and suspected informants had already turned up dead. Put those two histories in one prison unit, and the ending stops feeling accidental very quickly. The prison case eventually ended in pleas and sentences, rather than a murder trial. Reuters reported that in 2024, Gaius pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter after the government dropped more serious murder charges that could have brought life. He was sentenced to 25 years. De Collegiero, already serving a 25-year racketeering sentence from a Boston gang case, got another 51 months after pleading guilty to assault, resulting in serious bodily injury. McKinnon pleaded guilty to lying to federal agents and got time served. By then, the legal shape of the Bulger case was settled. Gaius was the principal killer in the government's account. De Collegiero was in the cell with him. McKinnon lied about what he knew. The case had started with murder charges in 2022 and ended with a three-man sequence of plea deals in 2024. There was another side to Bulger's death, and it had nothing to do with mob rank and everything to do with Bureau of Prisons failure. The DOJ Inspector General said in 2022 that Bulger's killing followed serious management and performance failures at multiple levels, bureaucratic incompetence, and flawed policies. The watchdog found no malicious intent by Bureau of Prisons employees, but it did find failures in communication, transfer processing, medical review, penref, and record handling. AP summarized the result even more plainly. Bulger was placed in general population at a violent prison after a transfer process so poor that the Inspector General said a chain of bureaucratic blunders left him exposed to rival gangsters. So the prison execution has two layers at once: organized crime motive inside the unit and institutional failure outside the unit. The reason this whole story holds together is that Bruno and Bulger sit on opposite ends of the same code. Bruno was a Genovese captain in Springfield who, according to federal prosecutors, was killed because the leadership believed he had spoken to the FBI and because his death would improve another man's standing. Bulger was an aging Irish mob figure whose informant history was known across the prison system, and prosecutors said inmates called him a snitch before he was beaten to death. In between those two deaths stands Fotios. First, he is the Springfield enforcer planning the murder of a Genovese captain. Then, he is the federal inmate killing one of America's most infamous mob informants.